Hey guys, tonight we begin with something special. We're diving into one of the darker, quieter corners of Roman history, a story that doesn't shout with battles or triumphs, but instead lingers in whispers, in rituals, and in the fate of women bound to silence. Before we step into tonight's story, take a second to like this video and subscribe, so these mysteries can reach others in your family too. And in the comments, tell me your location and the exact time you're watching this. It's always fascinating to see where you're tuning in from, almost like tiny lights glowing on a map across the world. Now, let's begin. The streets of Rome never truly slept. Even in the hours when the moonlight slid across the tiled roofs and the Forum lay hushed, the city seemed to breathe. A slow exhalation of stone, smoke, and human murmurs. Torches guttered along alleyways where stray dogs hunted scraps, merchants curled up beside their locked stalls, and soldiers paced the walls with dull-eyed weariness. Yet beneath the heavy silence of night, Rome carried voices, unspoken, half-remembered, lingering like ghosts between temples and arches. They were whispers, telling of lives swallowed not by the clash of battle, but by the unseen rituals that governed the heart of the empire. Among these whispers, none held more weight than those that clung to the shadow of the Vestal Virgins. For centuries, Romans had walked past the house of the Vestals, barely daring to glance at its walls. A stately complex of marble and silence, it seemed less a dwelling than a shrine, the air around it humming with restrained power. Children were warned not to linger near its gates. Mothers told stories that brushed between reverence and fear. Men, however bold in the taverns, lowered their voices when speaking of the priestesses who lived within. To be a Vestal was to embody purity, discipline, and Rome's very survival. But beneath that noble sheen, rumour threaded itself like ivy through stone. Stories of oaths broken, of forbidden desires, and of punishments so cruel that even Rome's executioners whispered the details rather than spoke them aloud. The city's foundations groaned with history, but the fate of the Vestals lingered like a wound never healed. And in the stillness of night, those who believed in omens claimed they could hear faint sounds rising from the earth, not the echo of water through aqueducts, nor the rumble of carts above, but softer, sadder tones. A sigh, a faint cry. The last breath of a woman buried alive. Rome, for all its power, had built itself on rituals as much as on legions. And the story of the Vestals began not in bloodshed or conquest, but in fire. The eternal flame of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, was more than a religious symbol. To Romans, it was the heartbeat of the state. As long as the flame burned, Rome endured. If it flickered out, the city itself was thought to teeter toward ruin. And so, from the earliest days of kings and councils, young girls were chosen to serve as the guardians of that fire. They were pulled from their families before their lives had scarcely begun, veiled in white, and bound to a vow that would last 3 decades. To the common citizen, they were holy beings, living emblems of Rome's stability. To senators, they were a reminder that religion and politics could never be pried apart. To the girls themselves, they were daughters severed from childhood, reshaped into symbols, and sealed behind the gates of marble halls. In the hush of the Forum, the house of the Vestals stood as both sanctuary and prison. Its gardens bloomed in silence, its fountains murmured endlessly, yet every sound seemed amplified by absence, the absence of laughter, of choice, of freedom. At dawn, the girls in white tended the fire with steady hands, eyes lowered, movements precise. At dusk, they walked the colonnades, their footsteps light but bound by expectation. Always watched, always weighed against the standard of perfection, They carried Rome on their shoulders with neither consent nor escape. And yet, in a city of 1 million souls, rumour could not be silenced. Market stalls buzzed with speculation, taverns crackled with dark jokes, and the whispers drifted into every crevice of Roman life. What happened, they asked, when a Vestal strayed from her sacred path? What punishment could equal the crime of betraying Rome itself? The answer, spoken in hushed tones, was burial. Not a burial of honour, but of horror. For when a Vestal Virgin broke her vow, when she was accused of unchastity, the state could not stain its hands with direct execution. To spill her blood was forbidden, for she was sacred. Instead, the city devised a ritual that was neither quick nor merciful. The condemned girl would be led, veiled and silent, to a chamber dug into the earth. Within it, a bed, a lamp, a loaf of bread, and a jug of water awaited, mocking provisions for a death that was meant to mimic life. Once she descended, the entrance was sealed, stone upon stone, until only darkness remained. She would breathe the stale air, hear the last echoes fade above, and wait as the city went on, indifferent, unbroken. It was the kind of death that haunted imagination. Soldiers accustomed to bloodshed shuddered at the thought of slow suffocation. Housewives crossing the forum averted their gaze when the procession passed, and children, told tales by candlelight, squeezed their blankets tight when they heard of the Vestal who coughed in the dark, who prayed into silence, who became one more whisper beneath the city. The punishment was rare, but rarity did not blunt its edge. If anything, it sharpened the terror, for every generation could recall a name, a face, a procession of white-clad priests leading a pale figure toward the earth. Rome remembered. Rome always remembered. Yet beneath the grandeur of marble and the rhetoric of senators, the story was not one of abstract rituals or nameless figures. It was of flesh and breath, of young women torn from the world they knew, placed upon pedestals they had not chosen, and condemned when they faltered. Behind every whisper lay a life, a child who once played in her father's courtyard, a sister who laughed beneath olive trees, a daughter who cried when first veiled in white. The city, however, was merciless in its devotion to order. The Vestals were symbols, not daughters, and symbols could not afford imperfection. Rome demanded their silence, their purity, their unwavering service, and when they failed, Rome demanded their lives. And so, as the city sprawled across its 7 hills, building roads, conquering lands, and engraving laws in stone, the house of the Vestals remained both heartbeat and tomb. Its walls carried the fragrance of incense and the echo of prayers, but also the weight of footsteps leading downward, into chambers meant never to be opened again. Those who claimed to hear the whispers beneath Rome said they came strongest at night, when the moon hung low and the wind drifted through the ruins. A sigh in the forum, a faint cry by the temple steps, the echo of a voice swallowed by earth. Perhaps imagination, perhaps memory. Yet in a city where gods were believed to walk among men, who could say what lingered beneath the stones? The eternal city lived by spectacle. Gladiators drenched the Colosseum sands, generals paraded their triumphs, emperors gilded their names in marble. But not all spectacles were public. Some were hidden, carried out in silence, known only by the tolling of ritual and the shudder of rumour. The fate of the Vestals belonged to that shadowed realm, a story buried as carefully as the girls themselves, yet too terrible to ever be forgotten. For even as the torchlight flickered in the hands of watchmen, even as the streets of Rome hummed with commerce and laughter by day, the night carried its own truth. Rome's greatness was not only built on victories and laws, but also on the bodies of those chosen to carry burdens too heavy for their years. The whispers beneath the eternal city were not merely sounds. They were memories, warnings, and accusations woven into the stones themselves. They asked, in voices too faint to silence, what does it mean to sacrifice the innocent for the survival of the state? What lingers when a society buries its daughters in the name of order? And as the moonlight slid once more across the tiled roofs, the house of the Vestals stood still, its flame flickering, its walls echoing with secrets. Within that silence Rome endured, but beneath the earth the whispers never ceased. At the heart of Rome, beyond the bustle of markets and the echo of sandals striking stone, there flickered a flame that no storm was permitted to extinguish. It was not a bonfire roaring into the heavens, nor a torch meant to ward off the night, but a small controlled blaze, steady and eternal, hidden within the round temple of Vesta. To Romans, this flame was not mere fire, it was life itself. As long as it burned, Rome endured. Should it falter, the very bones of the empire would tremble. The fire was entrusted not to soldiers, nor to kings, nor to emperors in their gilded halls. Its guardians were a handful of women, girls taken from their families, and bound to a sacred oath. They were called the Vestal Virgins, and the city's survival rested upon their devotion. Every morning, before the sun rose over the Palatine Hill, the temple stirred with careful movement. The air smelled of ash and oil, faint yet enduring, like the breath of the goddess herself. Within its circular walls, the flame rested in a bronze hearth, tended by hands small but steady. The Vestals moved about in silence, their veils pale in the dim light, their gestures deliberate, each one part of a ritual older than memory. They added wood, whispered prayers, sprinkled incense, and watched the sparks leap, ensuring that no lapse in their duty would allow the sacred fire to waver. The city outside may have woken to shouts and commerce, to the clatter of carts and the bray of animals, but here the world was reduced to breath and flame. The Vestals' lives revolved around this task, their every waking hour bound to its survival. They were not daughters or wives. They were symbols, living offerings to Vesta, and through her, to Rome itself. It was said that when Romulus and Remus, the twin founders of the city, were born, their mother had been a Vestal who broke her vows. Punished, she was condemned to death, but her children, abandoned and left to fate, survived to shape the destiny of the world. Whether this tale was myth or memory mattered little. To Romans, it meant the fire and its guardians stretched back to the very birth of their civilization. To serve as a Vestal was to stand within a lineage older than empire, older than conquest, older even than Rome itself. But beneath the reverence lay a weight that could crush the strongest spirit. The flame must never die. To let it falter was not simply negligence, it was treason, a sign that Rome had been abandoned by the gods. In such cases, the Vestal at fault faced punishment as severe as if she had betrayed the Republic itself. For some, it meant scourging, ritual lashes that left bruises hidden beneath veils. For others, if the extinguishing coincided with omens of disaster, the price could be far worse. Thus, every flicker of the flame was both comfort and terror. To the city, its constancy meant safety. To the girls who watched it, its demands meant sleepless nights, a heart racing with each wisp of smoke, and the knowledge that a moment's carelessness could summon ruin upon them all. The fire consumed their childhoods. While other girls learned to weave or to sing in courtyards, the Vestals learned the rhythm of ritual, the language of silence, the posture of statues. Their voices were rarely raised, their laughter discouraged, their steps measured. They were living embodiments of purity, each breath a vow, each glance a reminder that they no longer belonged to themselves. And yet, Rome exalted them. Senators rose when they entered chambers. Criminals touched by their presence were spared the lash, their word carrying the weight of law. They dined at banquets beside generals, sat in reserved seats at the games, and walked through the forum unescorted, their safety guaranteed by their sacred status. To the crowd, they seemed untouchable, robed in dignity, surrounded by invisible walls of reverence. But reverence is a gilded cage. The privileges given were only a mask for the chains beneath. For 30 years they served without choice. 10 years learning the rituals, 10 years performing them, 10 years teaching the next to take their place. Only after this could they return to the world beyond marble walls. By then, their youth was gone, their lives defined not by family or freedom, but by a fire that demanded everything. In the still hours of night, when Rome lay under stars and the hearth within the temple glowed softly, one can imagine the thoughts that stirred in their minds. Did they dream of homes they had left behind? Of mothers' arms? Of fields and villages far from the capital's weight? Or did they look upon the flame and see not duty, but chains of light burning away the life they might have lived? The city did not ask these questions. Rome cared only for order, for ritual, for the steady pulse of its eternal flame. The Vestals were not meant to feel or to long for what lay beyond the temple's walls. They were meant only to serve, and to serve without falter. Yet even within perfection, cracks can form. The fire, despite its divine aura, was still a thing of wood and air. It could sputter, it could smoke, it could die. And when it did, eyes turned not to the gods, but to the girls who had been trusted to guard it. It is easy to imagine the dread that fell upon them in such moments, the rush of panic, the prayers whispered too quickly, the desperate attempts to coax sparks from embers. And when their efforts failed, when the flame lay cold and still, the silence that followed must have been unbearable. For in that silence, the city judged, and punishment soon followed. The fire that could never die demanded more than vigilance. It demanded sacrifice, not of bodies upon altars, but of lives bent beneath its glow. And while the Romans saw stability in its light, the Vestals themselves bore the shadows. Even in later centuries, long after the Republic gave way to emperors, the Temple of Vesta remained central, its fire burning while the empire swelled and fractured, while Caesars rose and fell. The flame endured earthquakes, riots, invasions, the shifting of gods and emperors, until at last, in distant times, it was extinguished not by neglect, but by decree, when Christianity swept away the old rites. But in the age when Rome's power blazed brightest, the flame within the temple glowed as steady as the legion's march. Citizens drew comfort from its constancy, yet beneath that comfort lay unease, for they knew the price of its survival. They knew that the girls in white bore the burden of Rome's destiny, that their misstep could summon ruin, and that when failure came, punishment descended with merciless ritual. The fire was eternal, but the hands that guarded it were not. Flesh grew weary, eyes dimmed, hearts ached beneath the weight of vows made before girlhood had even ended. And still, they rose each dawn, walked in silence, and bent their lives toward the flame that was never allowed to die. The whispers that curled through the city, those tales of burial and suffocation, were born not only from the breaking of vows of chastity, but also from the fragile nature of fire itself. For Rome's survival demanded perfection, and perfection could not be guaranteed by human hands. The flame demanded guardians, But those guardians were mortal. And when mortal flesh failed, the earth itself became their tomb. So the fire flickered on, night after night, year after year, as Rome expanded its borders, as temples rose and triumphal arches gleamed. The citizens saw the glow and felt safe. They did not hear the sighs of the girls who kept it alive, nor see the shadows it cast upon their lives. The eternal flame was Rome's pride, but to those chosen to guard it, it was also a reminder. Their existence was not their own. They belonged to the goddess, to the city, to the unyielding fire that consumed everything it touched. And as the years passed, and as the rituals deepened into habit, the whispers of the city grew louder. For where there is fire, there are shadows, and in those shadows, the fate of the Vestals awaited: burial, silence, and the suffocating embrace of earth. The fire within Vesta's temple did not feed itself. To keep it alive, Rome demanded daughters, taken from their homes, stripped from their families, and bound to the goddess before they had even learned the weight of their own voices. The choosing was not random, it was ritual, deliberate, as precise as the patterns carved into marble. Every year, the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, would summon girls from the city and its surrounding lands. They had to be between 6 and 10 years old, young enough to be shaped, malleable as wax, untouched by the world that would soon be denied to them. Their families had to be of noble standing, their bloodlines unsullied by disgrace, their bodies free of blemish or imperfection. A limp, a scar, even the faintest hint of deformity was enough to cast them aside. Rome demanded not only purity of spirit, but also perfection of form. Once gathered, the girls stood in silence as the priest walked among them, robes heavy with authority, eyes scanning as if searching for some invisible mark left by the gods. Mothers clutched their daughters' hands. Fathers watched with rigid pride, and the air held a tremor that was both sacred and cruel. For to be chosen was both an honour beyond imagining and a loss too deep to measure. When the priest laid his hand on a child's shoulder, her life, as she had known it, ended. She was led away, veiled, and carried through the streets to the house of the Vestals. Behind her, her family stood frozen, torn between pride and grief. They had given a daughter to Rome, and in return they received honour, status, and the knowledge that their blood now flowed into the very lifeline of the city. Yet the child they had raised, the voice that once called them mother and father, was gone. For the chosen girls, there was no ceremony of farewell. Their small hands were not allowed to cling to the arms of their mothers, their cries muted by the solemn weight of ritual. They stepped across the threshold of the house of the Vestals, and the gates closed behind them. Childhood ended at the door. Inside, the silence was absolute. The sound of the city, the laughter, the barking dogs, the clang of metal in the smithies, was muffled, replaced by the quiet breath of cloistered halls and the eternal crackle of flame. The girls were greeted not as children, but as initiates. Their white veils were adjusted, their names recorded, and their voices, once free to sing in courtyards or chatter in kitchens, were stilled beneath the discipline of ritual. They became property of the goddess, and through her, of Rome itself. At first, the weight of silence must have been unbearable. These were children who had been pulled from play, from stories told by lamplight, from siblings and friends. Now they were expected to move like shadows, to learn the gestures of prayer, to memorize rites older than their grandparents. Laughter became a memory, replaced by the endless cycle of tending, learning, serving. Their games were no longer of dolls or stones, but of sacred implements, each object imbued with meaning that must never be misunderstood. Their teachers were elder Vestals, women who had already given decades of their lives to the flame. Stern, disciplined, unyielding, They shaped the girls as potters shape clay, smoothing away the roughness of childhood until nothing remained but ritual. The novices learned how to carry water in sacred vessels, how to prepare offerings, how to sweep the temple floors so no speck of ash would insult the goddess. They learned the language of omens, the signs in smoke, the rhythm of sacrifice. And most of all, they learned silence. For silence was not absence, it was control. To speak carelessly was to invite error, and error could not be tolerated. To complain was to dishonour the goddess. To dream aloud was to forget one's vow. So the girls learned to bury their voices, to keep their thoughts behind downcast eyes, to let their hearts beat without sound. The city saw only the surface, veiled figures moving through the forum with dignity, symbols of purity, untouchable and revered. They did not see the small hands that clenched at night, the tears swallowed in the dark, the ache of a life severed too soon. And yet, despite the silence, the walls of the House of the Vestals carried memory. Stones remember, and those stones had absorbed centuries of sighs, whispers, the muffled cries of girls who struggled against fate. The colonnades, beautiful in the sun, had seen children pacing in the shadows, wondering if they would ever again hear their mother's voice. The gardens, fragrant with roses, had hidden the soft footsteps of novices tracing paths they could never leave. The city called it privilege, but to the girls it was a gilded prison. Their hair was cut short, their garments stripped of colour, their laughter buried. They were taught that their bodies no longer belonged to themselves, but to Vesta. Their voices were silenced, not by cruelty alone, but by expectation. An expectation so absolute that even the faintest protest was swallowed whole. Rome demanded daughters, but it demanded them voiceless. And yet, the silence was never empty. Beneath it stirred longing, fear, and the faint rebellion of memory. For no matter how deep the vows, no matter how heavy the ritual, a child's heart remembers the warmth of home. It remembers fields where grass brushed the ankles, kitchens filled with bread scent, sisters laughing in courtyards. That memory, locked within silence, became the quietest form of resistance. But Rome was merciless with those who broke the rules. Even within their first years, the girls learned the consequence of failure. The stories whispered to them were not of comfort, but of warning. A Vestal who let the sacred fire die was scourged. A Vestal who broke her vow of chastity was buried alive. They were taught these punishments not as distant tales, but as living threats. Each ritual they performed carried the weight of survival. Each vow, whispered beneath the flame, carried the shadow of the tomb. So they learned quickly, for they had no choice. Their small shoulders bore Rome's destiny, and their voices, once silenced, never fully returned. By the time their years of service stretched into decades, they had become shadows of themselves, embodiments of ritual rather than of flesh. And yet, the city continued to take daughters, generation after generation, feeding them to the flame and silencing them within marble walls. It did so not out of cruelty alone, but out of fear. The fear that without these girls, the fire would falter, the gods would turn away, and Rome itself would crumble. The empire demanded sacrifice, and the sacrifice it demanded was silence. And so, beneath the grandeur of temples and the roar of legions, there always lingered the muted cries of children taken too soon. Their voices did not echo in the Senate, nor in the speeches of generals, nor in the scrolls of historians. They echoed only in stone, in whispers that clung to the marble of the House of the Vestals, in the hush of nights when the eternal flame flickered against the darkness. Rome lived by conquest, but it endured by silence. The silence of daughters chosen, voices buried beneath vows, and lives consumed by a fire that was never allowed to die. The veil was soft to the touch, but heavy with meaning. Draped over the heads of Rome's chosen daughters, its folds transformed children into symbols, silencing laughter and binding them to vows they were too young to understand. White, pure, untarnished, it looked like innocence preserved, yet in truth, it was innocence stolen. When the veil descended, childhood ended. A girl of 7 might have still carried dolls in her arms, still chased shadows across courtyards, still clung to her mother's side when storms rattled the rooftops. But once chosen, she was stripped of such small comforts. The white veil marked her not as a child, but as sacred, as untouchable, as property of Vesta. It covered her hair, a symbol of youth cut short, and turned her face into something the city no longer saw as her own. In the eyes of Rome, the veil was a crown. It separated the Vestal Virgin from every other woman in the city. No man could touch her. No voice could insult her without consequence. No hand could harm her without punishment. She walked the streets with an authority rare even among senators, her presence commanding respect from the crowd. To see the white veil was to see Rome's survival embodied. But to the child beneath the cloth, it was a weight that pressed down on her shoulders and whispered that her life was no longer hers. The rituals began immediately. Her games were replaced by lessons in sacred lore, her songs by hymns of devotion, her laughter by silence. Each day she practiced gestures until they became muscle memory, the careful movement of offering grain to the flame, the solemn carrying of water, the ritual words that must never be spoken with error. Mistakes were corrected swiftly, sometimes with scolding, sometimes with lashes sharp enough to leave marks hidden beneath her robes. The veil, though white, did not shield her from discipline. Yet what hurt more than correction was the absence of childhood itself. No chasing of siblings through gardens. No late-night stories whispered in bed. No chance to fall into her mother's arms when she was frightened. The veil erased all of that. She belonged not to family, but to Rome. Even the smallest gestures of freedom were forbidden. To braid her hair in the way her village had taught her, gone. To play in the dust with stones and sticks, gone. To run barefoot through fields, to climb fig trees, to swim in rivers, all gone. These were not things a veiled daughter of Rome was permitted to do. The city had carved away her girlhood, leaving behind only the statue-like figure of purity. To the citizens watching from outside, the veil shimmered with dignity. To the child, it was a curtain drawn between her and the world she once knew. At night, within the dormitories of the House of the Vestals, the young girls lay in their beds, the sound of the eternal fire crackling faintly through the halls. Some clutched their blankets tightly, eyes wide in the darkness. The silence was complete, yet inside their minds ran memories of home, a mother's lullaby, a father's voice calling them to supper, a brother's laughter as he ran through the fields. These echoes haunted them more than the stern gaze of their teachers. They were ghosts of a life stolen too soon. Rome believed it was honouring them. Families whose daughters were chosen walked taller in the forum, proud that their blood had been deemed pure enough to serve the goddess. Senators boasted of kin within the temple walls. The city paraded the selection of Sirad, proof that its future was secured. Yet for the child beneath the veil, the honour was a chain. She had been crowned and caged in the same breath. The white veil was also a warning. It told her that her body must remain untouched, her purity preserved at all costs. A whisper of desire, a glance too long, a secret meeting in the dark. Any of these could seal her fate. And her fate was not exile, nor humiliation, but the slow suffocation of being buried alive. The veil was a symbol of holiness, but also of the grave that waited should she fail. And so, each girl learned to carry herself as though carved from marble, her eyes lowered, her steps measured, her voice muted. The city praised her as a guardian of the flame, but she knew the truth. She was a child made into a statue, her life sacrificed to the illusion of Rome's eternity. As years passed, the veil became less foreign. The fabric that once itched against her scalp, that once felt like a shroud, became familiar, like skin she could not shed. She grew beneath it, but her childhood remained broken, left behind at the gates of the House of the Vestals. By the time she reached her teens, the girl who had entered was gone, replaced by a figure moulded to fit the demands of Rome. The veil had done its work. It had silenced the child and raised up the symbol. Still, shadows lingered. In the quiet of the gardens, where fountains trickled and roses bloomed, the girls sometimes glanced at one another with fleeting expressions, moments where childhood flickered through the marble mask. A half smile, a mischievous glance, a tear quickly brushed away. For beneath the veils, they were still human. The fire demanded godlike devotion, but the girls remained flesh, with hearts that beat against the silence. And Rome, despite all its power, could never fully erase that truth. The veil was white, but beneath it were thoughts unspoken, desires unnamed, memories unforgotten. And those hidden things, though buried, were never entirely lost. They lingered, growing heavier with each year of service, until for some, they erupted into choices that defied the goddess, the city, and the very fire they had sworn to protect. And when that happened, the veil, once a crown, became a funeral shroud. Rome would not tolerate broken vows. The child who had been veiled in honour could be cast into the earth in silence. One day lifted high as sacred, the next lowered into darkness. The veil marked her as chosen, but it also marked her as condemned, should she falter. So the white cloth that shimmered in the forum, that seemed so pure and dignified, carried with it the weight of broken childhoods and the shadow of the grave. It was a reminder that beneath the marble glory of Rome lay sacrifice too small to be seen by generals, too silent to be recorded in law. The veil concealed, but it could not erase the truth, that the empire demanded its daughters surrender their voices, their laughter, their freedom. It dressed them in white, but beneath the cloth lay the faint, unhealed wound of stolen childhood. The fire burned on. The veil fluttered in the forum. And the girls who wore it carried Rome's eternity upon their small shoulders, even as their own lives slipped quietly away. The flame rose and fell with the breath of the wind, but it never died. Within the circular temple at the heart of the forum, its light spilled across marble floors and flickered against gilded walls. It was not merely fire, it was Rome itself. To let it falter, even for a moment, was to invite disaster. The people believed that as long as the flame burned, their city stood protected, unbroken, eternal. And so, the duty of tending it fell to those who wore white veils and silent eyes. Day and night, the guardians moved around the hearth, feeding it with pine and oak, sprinkling salt and grain into its glow, whispering the sacred words that kept its spirit alive. To an outsider, the act might have looked simple: keep the fire burning. But to those who lived within its shadow, it was a burden far greater than their small hands should have carried. The flame consumed their days. At dawn, when the first sunlight touched the rooftops, The young women stirred from their beds, robes drawn tight against the chill. Their first task was always the same: cleanse the temple, sweep the marble, prepare the offerings, tend the embers that had survived the night. No jest, no distraction, no pause for fatigue could interrupt this rhythm. The fire waited for no one. Each hour demanded precision. Logs were arranged with care, ashes swept away in silence, every gesture rehearsed until it seemed more like instinct than choice. They learned to read the flame's movements. A sudden crackle might signal dryness in the wood. A wavering glow warned of drafts. A sudden surge seemed like a spirit stirred awake. The fire became a language only they could understand, a companion that required devotion, yet gave nothing in return. But it was not only the mechanics of flame they learned. Around it gathered layers of ritual that carried meaning heavier than stone. They sprinkled offerings of flour as though feeding the city itself. They carried water in vessels that must never touch the ground, for purity could not be stained by earth. They sang hymns older than their own names, verses passed down through generations of girls who had worn the same veil, walked the same marble, borne the same burden. It was not the fire alone that mattered. It was the idea that through this constant watch, Rome itself remained alive. And because of that belief, no mistake was forgiven. Should the flame falter, punishment fell swift and merciless. Some analysts whispered of times when the fire died and famine followed, or enemy armies pressed harder at Rome's gates, as though the gods themselves had punished the city for the carelessness of its daughters. In those moments, the guardians themselves bore the blame. The white veil that crowned them turned into a mark of shame, and the lash was brought down until their skin burned, as the fire had not. The flame was a tether. It bound them to sleepless nights, endless days, constant vigilance. While the rest of Rome feasted, laughed, or marched to war, the guardians circled the hearth, eyes never far from its glow. No festival excused them. No personal grief allowed them absence. Birthdays passed unnoticed, seasons turned without remark. The world outside shifted and changed, but inside the temple the flame burned the same, unchanged, eternal. And so their lives became measured not in years, but in logs of oak and handfuls of ash. The people revered them, yet few paused to see the weariness in their faces. They saw only the veiled figures moving with solemn grace, never faltering, never failing, symbols of Rome's endurance. But behind the veil, eyes blinked heavy with fatigue. Behind the ritual, hands trembled with exhaustion. To keep the flame alive meant sacrificing the fire of their own spirits, slowly, steadily, year after year. The temple itself seemed designed to magnify their burden. Its roof opened to the sky, letting in rain, wind and smoke. In winter, the chill crept down into their bones. In summer, the heat pressed upon them like a cloak of iron. Smoke stung their eyes, coated their lungs, clung to their robes, until even in sleep they smelled of ash. They carried the scent of the flame wherever they went, marked by it, inseparable from it. But more than their bodies, it was their minds the fire consumed. For the flame was not just wood and spark. It was a symbol that demanded perfection. A slip of the tongue in ritual words, a hesitation in gesture, a single ember left unattended. Each could be magnified into cosmic disaster. The girls grew up under the shadow of such fear, learning to walk carefully, to speak carefully, to think carefully, until every part of their being bent toward service. And yet, despite the fear, there was a strange pride in their task. For all its weight, the fire gave them power unmatched by other women of Rome. Senators stepped aside in the forum when they passed. Condemned prisoners touched their robes in hopes of mercy. A simple gesture from their hand could spare a life. No other woman commanded such reverence. They were both burdened and exalted, prisoners and queens within the same breath. To guard the flame was to be both captive and sovereign. Still, even pride could not erase the price. Their childhoods had already been broken when the veil fell upon them, and now their youth burned away in the constant glow of the hearth. The laughter of other girls echoed outside temple walls, distant and unreachable. They heard whispers of festivals, of dances, of marriages, of lives filled with choices they would never know. And while the fire roared within the temple, a quieter fire smouldered within them, the fire of longing, unspoken, suppressed. The years stretched on, unchanging. A girl who entered at 7 left, if she survived her vows, at nearly 40. By then she was no longer a child, nor even truly a woman of the world. She was something apart, shaped by smoke and silence, bound more to gods than to men. Some left the temple unable to find a place in the city, their lives too long tied to ritual to ever bend again to ordinary rhythms. The flame that had burned for Rome had left them hollow, its glow seared into their very bones. And yet the city asked for more. For every girl who completed her service, another was chosen to replace her, another veil lowered over another small head, another childhood broken in the name of eternity. The fire never went out, because generation after generation of daughters fed it with their time, their freedom, their lives. The guardians of the flame were celebrated in marble inscriptions, honoured in ceremonies, spoken of in hushed awe. But their humanity was buried beneath those honours, hidden beneath white cloth and endless smoke. They were seen as embodiments of purity, but not as children who had once laughed, not as young women who had once dreamed. The fire consumed those things, leaving only ash. And so the flame burned on, steady and eternal, while the lives that fed it slipped quietly into shadow. Rome celebrated its eternity, never pausing to ask the cost. The Temple of Vesta looked simple from the outside. A round building set among the grand colonnades of the Forum, its white marble rising like a calm beacon amid the noise of the city. Passers-by saw only its perfect symmetry, its polished steps, its columns gleaming in the sun. They walked past it as if it were nothing more than another shrine in a city overflowing with gods. Few paused to think of what happened inside. Few wondered about the lives woven into its silence. Within those walls, however, a different Rome existed, quiet, shadowed, hidden from the clamour of politics and trade. It was a Rome not of senators and soldiers, but of whispers, of rituals repeated endlessly, of girls bound by vows that cut deeper than chains. Marble can seem eternal, but it cannot speak. And so the temple guarded its secrets carefully. Those who entered the sacred space saw only what they were meant to see, the ever-burning flame tended by women clothed in white, moving with practiced grace. They did not see the exhaustion in their eyes or the hesitations in their steps. They did not hear the hushed arguments that broke out in the still hours of night, when smoke filled the air and tempers cracked under the weight of duty. They did not notice the small rebellions hidden in gestures, the pause of a hand, the lingering of a gaze, the barely audible sigh that slipped from lips pressed too long in silence. Behind the marble walls, humanity lingered. The guardians were meant to be symbols of purity, living vessels of Rome's endurance. But symbols, however carefully crafted, are still flesh beneath. A girl chosen at 7 might learn to hold her tongue, to hide her face behind a veil, to walk in silence down marble corridors. Yet the child remained within her, stubborn and restless, yearning for warmth beyond the fire's glow. The temple could demand her obedience, but it could not erase her thoughts. It was in these private thoughts, locked away from the gaze of the forum, that the first cracks appeared. A longing for laughter that could not be spoken aloud. A memory of family that never entirely faded. A curiosity about the world beyond the marble gates. The guardians of the sacred flame were told to bury such feelings, yet they lingered, rising like smoke in the corners of the mind, impossible to banish entirely. Some secrets were small, an extra piece of bread taken in hunger, a hidden trinket kept from childhood, a whispered word shared when silence was demanded. Others carried far greater weight. Not all Vestals accepted their fate without resistance. Some found ways to slip beyond the temple walls under cover of darkness, craving a taste of life forbidden to them. A glimpse of the markets at night, the smell of roasting meat, the laughter of men with wine on their breath. Each temptation threatened to undo the vows that bound them. For a guardian of Vesta, even the hint of indulgence carried danger. A gaze too long, a touch too daring, a step too far could mean the difference between honour and the slow suffocation of a living tomb. Rome prided itself on laws, but the marble walls of the temple had laws of their own, stricter, sharper, and far less forgiving. The Vestals carried both reverence and suspicion wherever they walked. To the people, they were untouchable, sacred, above reproach. Yet the same city that honoured them waited eagerly for signs of failure. A shadow of scandal could transform them from symbols of purity into examples of corruption. And once suspicion took root, Rome showed no mercy. The marble walls remembered the whispers of trials, names spoken carefully, accusations delivered in trembling voices. A guardian accused of neglecting her duties. Another accused of straying from her vows. Sometimes the charges were born of truth. Sometimes they were born of politics, envy, or revenge. But inside the temple, where secrecy cloaked every gesture, it was difficult to know which. The secrets of the temple were not only those of its daughters. Senators leaned close in its corridors, voices lowered, using the space as a meeting ground where words could vanish into sacred silence. Priests carried messages wrapped in ritual, hiding politics beneath the veil of religion. Ambitious men found ways to twist the sanctity of the guardians into weapons, using accusations against them as tools to destroy rivals or manipulate the people. The marble walls did not discriminate. They sheltered the whispers of both the innocent and the corrupt. Even the sacred fire itself was a participant in these secrets. To the people outside, it was only flame. But to those who tended it, the fire became a mirror of Rome's fortunes. A sudden sputter might be read as a warning. A strong blaze seemed like a blessing. Its glow could justify a leader's ambition or condemn a rival's fall. And so the guardians stood by it, their faces lit by its glow, carrying the heavy knowledge that every flicker could change the course of empire. Yet what weighed heaviest were the unspoken fears. The fear of failure, the fear of punishment, the fear of being buried alive in darkness. Each guardian carried this dread in silence, never daring to speak it aloud, for to name it was to bring it closer. But the marble walls heard their thoughts all the same, felt their steps quicken in the night, saw their hands tremble as they fed the fire. The walls knew of tears shed in solitude, when no one could see. They knew of the quiet resentment simmering beneath duty, of the longing for freedom, of the quiet envy of ordinary women who walked outside, free of the veil, free of the weight of eternity. They knew of the friendships that formed in whispers, small sparks of comfort in the shadows, and of the betrayals that sometimes followed, when fear turned loyalty into silence or accusation. Secrets were the true currency of the temple. Each guardian carried them, shared them, buried them. Some would never be known beyond those walls. Others would one day spill into the streets of Rome, shaking the empire with their consequences. But for the moment, they remained hidden, buried beneath marble, locked within stone, as silent as the guardians themselves. And so the temple stood, white and perfect to those who passed by, its columns gleaming, its roof open to the sky. The people saw only what they were allowed to see. They did not notice the weight of eyes behind veils, the cracks in voices, the restless hearts bound by vows too heavy for any child to bear. They could not hear the whispers echoing in the silence of the night, carried from wall to wall like ghosts. Rome believed the Temple of Vesta was eternal. Yet within its marble walls, eternity was bought with secrets, some too heavy to be spoken, others too dangerous to remain hidden forever. The city slept while the flame burned, but the guardians and the walls around them did not sleep. They remembered. They listened. They kept their secrets in silence, as carefully as they kept the fire alive. The hearth glowed with a steady pulse, its smoke curling upward towards the open roof. In the hush of that sacred circle, the guardians of the fire stood bound not only by duty, but by promises that had been carved into their very lives. These promises were not written on tablets or scrolls, not inked on parchment or preserved in wax. They lived instead in breath and ritual, carried from mouth to mouth, sealed by the weight of divine expectation. An oath taken within the Temple of Vesta was no ordinary vow. It was not a pledge to another mortal, to a family, or even to a state. It was a vow to the gods themselves, to Rome as an idea, to the eternity that stretched beyond stone and time. To break it was not only to dishonour, but to unravel the very threads of protection woven over the city. And so the girls spoke the words with trembling lips when their childhood was stripped away and the veil was lowered upon their heads. The words were simple in form, yet unbearable in weight. They promised to keep themselves pure, untouched by any desire of the flesh. They promised to guard the flame, never allowing its light to falter. They promised obedience, silence, devotion. Each phrase bound them tighter, until their lives no longer belonged to themselves, but to the gods and the city. Those oaths lingered long after the words themselves had been spoken. They clung to every gesture, every choice, every moment of hesitation. They were not reminders written on stone. They were reminders written on the skin, carved into the heart, woven into the rhythm of thought. Each time a guardian raised her hand to sprinkle grain into the fire, she felt the weight of the oath. Each time she lowered her eyes before the gaze of Rome, the words echoed in silence. To many, the image of purity seemed fragile, delicate, easily broken. But for those who bore it, purity was a blade. It cut through the warmth of companionship, through the comfort of closeness, through the possibility of love. It separated them from the world, left them suspended between mortal and divine. And in its shadow, the oath pressed down until every breath seemed borrowed, every thought carefully measured. The people outside saw honour in these vows. They admired the guardians, pointed to them as living proof of Rome's sacred strength. Yet they did not see the cost. They did not see the girl whose heart beat faster at the sight of a smile in the crowd, who buried the feeling until it smouldered like ash in her chest. They did not see the one who lay awake in the temple, staring at the flickering shadows, wondering if the gods truly cared for her suffering. They did not hear the silent prayers whispered not to Vesta, but to freedom. And there were others still who, despite the weight of their vows, stumbled beneath them. The records of Rome preserved their names like warnings carved in stone, A guardian accused of breaking her purity was not simply punished, she was condemned as though she had betrayed the gods themselves. Her body became the proof of her crime, her silence the measure of her guilt. And the punishment was as cruel as the oath was sacred, to be buried alive. The paradox was sharp. To shed the blood of a Vestal was forbidden, for she was sacred. But to allow her to live after her vows were broken was unthinkable. And so Rome devised a punishment both silent and absolute. She was lowered into the earth, sealed away in a chamber where air grew thin and light vanished. Bread, water, and a small lamp were left beside her, not as mercy, but as a ritual gesture to soothe the gods. Then the earth closed over her, and her oath became her tomb. The ground swallowed not only her body, but her voice, her story, her humanity. The people above carried on with their lives, assured that Rome was safe, that the gods had been appeased. But beneath their feet lay the echo of words once spoken in trembling youth, words that had promised obedience, purity, eternal devotion. An oath that had begun with fire ended in suffocating darkness. Not every secret oath led to such an end, but the possibility hovered over every guardian's head like a shadow. Each step taken within the temple carried the silent knowledge that misstep meant death, not swift but buried, forgotten beneath earth. This awareness shaped every moment, every glance, every silence. To live under oath was to live always with the taste of ash in the mouth, always with the fear of blood that must never be shed. And yet for all its cruelty, the oath bound them together in ways unseen by those outside. They were not sisters by birth, nor daughters of the same house, but they were woven into the same fate. Each bore the same vows, each carried the same risk. In whispers at night, when the flame crackled softly and the city outside slept, they comforted one another with small words, reminders that they were not alone in their silence. Their lives were parallel lines, running side by side, never breaking free, but never entirely separated. The temple preserved these moments as much as it preserved the fire. Its marble floors felt the weight of bare feet pacing in restless thought. Its walls absorbed the whispered confessions, the quiet fears, the promises of loyalty that stretched beyond ritual. Within its circle, the guardians carried not only Rome's eternity, but one another's burdens. Still, the oaths never loosened their grip. A girl who once played in the streets with her brothers grew into a woman who could not even hold her own hand without remembering the god's gaze. A smile given too freely became a risk. A touch too long lingered in the memory like guilt. Life narrowed to ritual, to silence, to the endless glow of the fire. And so, the guardians lived in a strange duality. Outwardly, they were symbols of Rome's strength, revered and honoured wherever they walked. Inwardly, they were captives of their own promises, shackled by words spoken long ago, unable to escape the shadow of punishment. They carried their devotion not as a gift, but as a wound that could never heal. Oaths written in ash and blood do not fade. They burn long after the words themselves have died. They live in the breath of those who spoke them, in the silence that follows, in the earth that closes over the broken. And within the circle of the temple, those oaths remained, binding the guardians more tightly than any chain of iron could. The flame burned on, steady as ever, but beneath its glow, the weight of vows pressed down. For the city, it was protection. For the girls, it was a lifelong sentence, etched into their very being. And Rome, eternal in its pride, never questioned the cost. Rome prided itself on order, ritual, and the steady pulse of traditions that bound its citizens to the gods. But even in a world where marble temples gleamed and priests intoned their hymns with precision, shadows crept quietly through the cracks of faith. Betrayal was one such shadow. For the Vestal Virgins, betrayal was more than a whispered secret. It was a death sentence, a curse that bound not just the body, but the very soul to infamy. The city, so quick to celebrate their purity, was just as quick to abandon them when whispers turned to accusations. The rituals of Rome taught that harmony depended on faithfulness. Gods kept to their bargains, citizens obeyed their rulers, soldiers honoured their vows, and the Vestals guarded the sacred flame. Should even one of these falter, the delicate balance of the city might collapse. And betrayal, more than mere disobedience, was believed to poison the pact itself. It was in this air of suspicion that the Vestals lived, their oaths fragile shields against rumour, envy, or the shifting winds of politics. Imagine a young Vestal walking through the forum, her white veil brushing against her shoulders, her steps watched by merchants, senators, and slaves alike. To the crowd, she was the embodiment of Rome's soul, but beneath the admiration lingered unease. If she faltered, if she allowed a lover into her heart, or neglected the flame, the gods might punish the entire city. Every eye carried not just reverence, but also judgment, waiting, testing, doubting. For a girl in her teens, this was less an honour and more a quiet, unending trial. The shadow of betrayal did not always come from within the Vestals themselves. Often it drifted closer from outside, from men who sought to bend their untouchable status for personal gain. Senators, ambitious generals, even emperors, some looked upon the Vestals as both sacred and vulnerable, believing that possession of such purity might lend them divine favour. The girls, trapped behind ritual smiles and carefully measured gestures, carried a silent dread that any misstep, any perceived weakness, could make them prey to desires disguised as devotion. Rome's records preserve fragments of scandal. Names echo across centuries, Vestals accused of violating their vows, dragged before tribunals, their fates sealed beneath the weight of public outrage. The punishment was unlike any other in the Roman world. Because a Vestal could not be executed in the ordinary sense, their blood was too sacred to spill. They were instead buried alive. The city would construct a small chamber underground, stocked with oil, bread, and water, as if mocking the idea of mercy. Then, before a hushed crowd, the condemned priestess would be led there, veiled and silent, her life entombed while the people whispered prayers above her grave. But the truth was rarely so clear. Were these women truly guilty? Or were they pawns in games of politics and power, convenient scapegoats when famine struck? Or when Rome's enemies pressed too hard at the gates? A drought might be blamed on a Vestal's supposed impurity. A military defeat might stir accusations that the sacred flame had flickered. To betray Rome was a crime beyond forgiveness, but to accuse was often far easier than to prove. And in this fragile space between devotion and rumour, the shadow of betrayal thrived. One story tells of a Vestal named Aemilia, guardian of the flame in a time of famine. When the sacred fire went out, the city trembled. Food was scarce, tempers high, and the people whispered of divine anger. Though accidents could happen, the wood damp, the wind fickle, Aemilia's carelessness was recast as betrayal. She was accused of neglecting her duties, her purity questioned. Yet in desperation, she claimed that the goddess Vesta herself had relit the flame as proof of her innocence. Miraculously, or perhaps conveniently, the fire burned again, and her life was spared, but the shadow lingered, a reminder that salvation depended less on truth than on perception. Such stories reveal the fragile threads holding a Vestal's fate. Betrayal did not need to be proven beyond doubt. Suspicion was enough. And suspicion was everywhere, in the nervous glance of another priestess, in the shifting eyes of a senator who saw opportunity in scandal, in the trembling of a hand as the flame was fed. The city's hunger for purity meant that any stumble could be twisted into evidence of corruption. To live as a Vestal was to walk a path lined with daggers, every step weighed by the fear of unseen blades. But betrayal was not always about love or flame. Sometimes it came in the form of words spoken carelessly, secrets shared beyond marble walls. The Vestals held knowledge few others did, rituals whispered at altars, prayers spoken in the dead of night. To reveal them, even in confidence, was a violation of their oaths. And in Rome, where religion and politics intertwined like vines, even a single misplaced word could carry consequences for generations. What if a Vestal, pressured by a senator, revealed a detail of sacrifice or timing? What if a secret fell into the wrong ears? Betrayal was not just flesh meeting flesh, but word meeting ear. And yet perhaps the cruelest betrayal was Rome's own. The city exalted these women as goddesses in life, giving them privileges unmatched by others, seats at games, the power to free prisoners with a touch, protection from harm. But when suspicion fell, these honours evaporated in an instant. Rome, so quick to praise, turned colder than stone when it smelled disgrace. The same crowd that once bowed its head as a Vestal passed would later cheer as she was led to her tomb. Betrayal was not only feared within the sisterhood, it was baked into the very system that raised them up. Consider the image of the burial ritual. The condemned priestess, her hands bound, her veil pulled low, walking through a silent crowd. Some wept, others turned away, but most simply watched. The chamber into which she was lowered was narrow, dark, suffocating. It was said the Romans chose this method to avoid spilling sacred blood, yet in truth it was a cruelty disguised as piety. For in that small underground space, death did not come quickly. It crept slowly, breath by breath, as the girl was left alone with her gods, abandoned by the city she had sworn to protect. If betrayal hung over the Vestals, then this was its final shadow, the betrayal of mercy itself. But perhaps the greatest tragedy of betrayal lay not in punishment, but in silence. The Vestals did not write their own histories. Their voices, their truths, were swallowed by time. What we know comes from men, senators, historians, poets, each with their own agenda, their own biases. The accused women had no chance to defend themselves beyond the narrow stage of trial, their words rarely preserved. And so the shadow lengthens across the centuries, obscuring guilt and innocence alike. Were they faithless? Were they victims? The silence itself is the betrayal, leaving us only fragments, never the full story. The shadow of betrayal is not a single tale, but a pattern woven again and again into Rome's memory. It shows us a society both enthralled by purity and obsessed with punishment. A people who built their strength on devotion, yet lived in fear of corruption. For the Vestals, betrayal was not only the fear of failing the gods, but the certainty that Rome itself could turn against them without warning. And in that tension between honour and suspicion, praise and punishment, their lives were lived, their fates sealed. The eternal city, in its pursuit of order, left its most sacred guardians forever balanced on the knife's edge of trust. And in that balance, shadows gathered, whispering warnings to those who listened. That faith, once broken, is rarely mended. That purity, once questioned, is never restored. And that even the holiest of Rome's daughters could not escape the shadow of betrayal. Rome was a city that thrived on boundaries, between sacred and profane, honour and shame, order and chaos. The Vestal Virgins were born of this tension. Their very existence was meant to bridge the divine and the human, to embody purity so absolute that the city's fate could rest upon their shoulders. And yet, there was no role in Rome more precarious. For when the line between duty and failure blurred, when sacred service appeared to turn into betrayal, Rome did not hesitate to call it crime. To understand the weight of this transformation, one must imagine how Romans thought of law itself. For them, law was not only a tool of governance, it was a reflection of cosmic order. To violate an oath, to neglect a ritual, was not merely an act of disobedience, it was treason against the gods. The Vestals, chosen as daughters of Vesta, stood at the very centre of this system. Their duties were unlike those of generals or consuls, for their battlefield was a hearth, their victory measured in the quiet constancy of a flame. And because their service was sacred, the stakes were immeasurable. To stumble was not to err, but to commit a crime against Rome's very survival. Accusations were the beginning of this collapse. The city, so reliant on omens, signs, and interpretations, was fertile ground for suspicion. A poor harvest, a sudden eclipse, or a military defeat could all spark whispers. Perhaps a Vestal had broken her vow. Perhaps her chastity had failed. Perhaps the goddess herself was angered. In such moments, the fragile fabric of faith unravelled quickly. The same women who had been honoured with front-row seats at games, who could command respect from senators, were suddenly transformed into criminals in the eyes of the people. And yet, the irony was sharp. Their so-called crimes were often invisible, intangible, known only by rumour and accusation. Unlike theft or murder, there was rarely a weapon, no stolen goods, no body in the street. The crime was a breach of purity. A wound that could not be seen yet was said to infect the city itself. Rome demanded proof, but proof was elusive. Trials were less about evidence than about performance, about the city demonstrating, before gods and men, that it would not tolerate impurity at the heart of its religion. Consider the case of Cornelia, chief Vestal under Emperor Domitian. Her story, like so many others, is layered with uncertainty. Accused of violating her vows of chastity, she stood before a tribunal that judged not only her, but the very relationship between Rome and the divine. She protested her innocence. Yet innocence was fragile in the face of politics. Domitian, eager to enforce his authority and remind the people of his stern piety, condemned her regardless. She was buried alive, her cries swallowed by the earth, while the emperor looked on. Whether guilty or not, her supposed crime served its purpose: to reassure the city that corruption would not be tolerated, even from the holiest of its guardians. The transformation of sacred duty into crime reveals much about Roman fears. For what Rome feared most was not the breaking of human laws, but the anger of gods. If a Vestal failed, the consequences were believed to ripple outward: drought, famine, defeat in battle. To punish her was not only justice, it was sacrifice, a grim offering to restore balance. Thus Rome cloaked cruelty in ritual, burying its daughters alive, not out of malice alone, but from terror of divine wrath. Still, behind this piety lurked ambition and politics. The trials of Vestals were often tangled with the ambitions of emperors and senators. A woman condemned meant a statement of power, a demonstration that no one, however sacred, stood above the authority of Rome's rulers. It was a dangerous symmetry. The women who embodied the god's favour could just as easily be cast as villains whose fall reasserted human authority. In this way, their lives were never entirely their own. Sacred duty was a mask, and beneath it lay the possibility of becoming the perfect scapegoat. And yet, Despite the terror of these accusations, there were moments when Rome itself seemed to hesitate. The burial ritual, with its food and water, its sealed chamber, was a peculiar compromise. Romans insisted they could not shed Vestal blood without offending the gods further. So they created a punishment that placed the weight of death not on themselves, but on fate. By entombing a woman with provisions, they claimed her survival, should it occur, would mean the gods had intervened. Her death, slow and inevitable, was not the fault of men, but the decree of heaven. Thus Rome absolved itself even as it condemned. But the cruelty lay not only in the punishment, it lay in the isolation that preceded it. To be accused was to stand apart, to feel the city turn its eyes from reverence to suspicion. Sisters who once prayed together might avoid meeting one another's gaze, fearful of being tainted by association. The same veil that had once marked a girl as untouchable now became the shroud of her disgrace. Sacred duty, once her shield, transformed overnight into evidence of a crime that could not be forgiven. The silence of the accused deepens the tragedy. Rarely do their voices reach us. What remains are fragments written by men, judges, historians, emperors, who saw these women less as individuals and more as symbols. Their testimonies, if spoken, were swallowed by the rituals of the trial. Their pleas, if made, were drowned in the roar of a crowd eager to restore balance by any means. We cannot know whether guilt clung to their hearts or innocence burned on their lips. History offers us only the verdict. Crime, this absence is telling. For to Rome, the truth of the matter mattered less than the performance of justice. It was not whether a Vestal had sinned that concerned them most, but whether Rome could convince itself it had purged impurity. Duty became crime, not in the act itself, but in the telling, in the way suspicion hardened into ritual, and ritual into burial. Imagine, then, the streets of Rome on such a day. The people gather, silent but restless. The accused is led through the crowd, her veil covering her face, her steps unsteady but unbroken. No chains bind her hands, for the city will not humiliate its daughter further. Yet each step toward the underground chamber is heavier than iron shackles. The onlookers watch, some with pity, some with fear, others with a grim satisfaction that order is being restored. At the edge of the forum, the earth waits, and with it, the transformation of devotion into disgrace, of sacred duty into crime. And the city continues. After the ritual, life resumes. Merchants call out prices in the market. Senators argue in the curia. Children chase one another through narrow alleys. The burial becomes a memory, absorbed into the stone and dust of the eternal city. Rome convinces itself it has acted justly, that balance has been restored. Yet the earth beneath its streets holds the silence of women who once kept its flame, women whose only crime may have been to live under the shadow of impossible expectations. This is the heart of the paradox. Sacred duty demanded perfection, but perfection is a fragile thing. To stumble, to falter, even to appear uncertain was enough to condemn. In the eyes of Rome, there was no distinction between weakness and crime, between human frailty and divine betrayal. And so, again and again, sacred duty became a pathway not to honour, but to the tomb. What remains is a lesson etched in whispers and silence. The Vestals, revered and feared, lived lives balanced on a knife's edge, where devotion could become accusation overnight, and duty could be transformed into crime by the breath of rumour. Their fate reminds us not only of Rome's hunger for order, but of the cost of demanding purity from those too human to sustain it. And in the dust of the Forum, where the stones remember what people forget, their shadows linger still, guardians of a flame that could never die, yet victims of a justice that too easily mistook suspicion for truth. In the heart of Rome, where the marble temples rose high above the dust of the Forum, judgment was not only an act of law, but a theatre of faith. When a Vestal Virgin was accused, the city itself seemed to hold its breath. For hers was no ordinary trial. It was not theft or murder to be measured by evidence, but a matter of purity, an invisible crime judged in a very visible way. And those who sat in judgment wore togas, their faces set in stone, their decisions heavy with the weight of gods and men alike. The role of judge in such matters often fell to Rome's highest authority, the Pontifex Maximus. This was no distant priest in a quiet temple, but a figure who stood at the very centre of Roman power. Sometimes that title was held by the chief of the priestly colleges. At other times, it was the emperor himself who claimed the office, blending divine guardianship with political dominion. To condemn a Vestal was to declare that the city's relationship with its gods had been disturbed, and only the most powerful men could speak on such matters. Their togas were pristine, draped carefully over shoulders, folds arranged to project gravity and control. They sat not as men of flesh and blood, but as embodiments of the law, of tradition, of divine authority itself. Before them stood a girl who had once been revered, now trembling beneath their gaze. They were judges, but their eyes were not the eyes of friends or protectors. They were the eyes of stone, unmoved by tears, untouched by pleas. The setting of such trials amplified their severity. They did not take place in secret, but often in spaces heavy with meaning, near temples in the Forum, sometimes even within the shadow of Vesta's own shrine. These locations were chosen not for convenience, but for symbolism. The gods themselves, it was implied, bore witness. The accused was not only judged by men in togas, but by the eternal flames and silent statues that lined the sacred precincts. Every column, every altar, seemed to loom like another pair of unblinking eyes. Evidence, in the Roman sense, was never the decisive factor. What mattered was interpretation. Omens, testimonies, public sentiment, all wove together into a fabric that could strangle as easily as it could support. If the sacred fire had flickered low, if a storm had torn through the city, if soldiers had fallen in battle, such misfortunes could be laid at the feet of a single girl in white. The judges, cloaked in the authority of tradition, claimed not only to weigh facts, but to read the will of the gods. And who could dispute such readings, when the gods themselves remained silent? The trial of a Vestal was thus as much ritual as it was legal proceeding. The accused was veiled, her voice often barely heard. Around her, senators and priests whispered, their expressions carefully controlled, as though showing too much pity might itself be dangerous. For to show mercy to impurity risked offending the gods further. The judges, with faces carved into masks of solemnity, bore the responsibility of appearing impartial. Yet their verdicts were shaped as much by politics and fear as by piety. One must imagine the pressure upon these men. To acquit a Vestal was to gamble with the fate of Rome itself. If famine struck the following year, if war was lost, suspicion would turn upon the judges, who would be accused of failing to cleanse the city of corruption. To condemn her, on the other hand, was to show firmness, to reassure the people that order had been restored. The decision was rarely about truth, it was about survival, of the city, of the judges, of the fragile pact between gods and men. And so the eyes of stone looked down, searching for signs not of innocence, but of guilt that would confirm the city's anxieties. A blush, a faltering step, a trembling hand, all could be read as confession. Silence, meant to convey dignity, might be twisted into arrogance. Tears, meant to show sincerity, could be seen as weakness. In the shadow of such scrutiny, the accused had little chance. The judgment was often decided before the trial had even begun. But there was more than fear in these courts. There was ambition. Judges were men of politics, after all, their careers tied to displays of authority. To preside over the condemnation of a Vestal was to show one's piety and strength to the Roman people. It was a demonstration that one placed the city above sentiment, that one would not hesitate to sacrifice even the most sacred daughters for the good of Rome. Such severity could elevate a man's reputation, carving his name into the memory of the crowd. And so, with stone-like faces, they spoke the words that sealed a woman's fate, even as whispers of ambition stirred behind their togas. The accused, standing before them, must have felt the weight of history pressing down, for she knew what awaited her should the verdict turn against her. Burial alive, the slow suffocation of darkness. The chamber prepared for her was not far from the forum itself, as though the city wished to keep her death close at hand, a warning to all who might falter. To hear the judgment pronounced was to hear the earth itself opening, ready to swallow her whole. There is a cruelty in the way these trials erased individuality. The Vestals were not judged as women, with personal histories, fears, or desires. They were judged as symbols, as vessels of Rome's purity. Once accused, they ceased to be daughters or sisters or friends. They became embodiments of impurity, shadows that had to be cast out so that the city might continue to thrive. The judges did not look into the eyes of a girl, they looked into the imagined eyes of the gods, and they spoke not to her, but to the crowd, to the city, to eternity. And yet, despite this ritualized severity, cracks appear in the record. There are tales of Vestals acquitted, of girls spared by sudden miracles, or the unexpected boldness of a sympathetic judge. In such cases, the city would breathe relief, convincing itself that the gods had intervened. But even acquittal carried scars. Suspicion, once raised, rarely faded entirely. The eyes of stone may have turned aside, but the shadows of accusation lingered, following the woman for the rest of her service, perhaps for the rest of her life. The transformation of trial into ritual reveals something deeper about Rome itself. Justice was not about fairness, but about performance, about reassuring the people that balance had been restored. The judges, wrapped in their togas, became actors in a play as old as the city, their roles written long before the trial began. They stood as pillars of tradition, their eyes fixed on the accused, their hearts hidden behind stone. And when the verdict was given, it was less a matter of guilt or innocence than of Rome declaring to itself, "We have done what must be done." Imagine, then, the forum at twilight, the trial concluded. The crowd disperses, murmuring prayers or gossip, the judges returning to their homes, their faces calm, their decisions recorded in silence. But the accused remains. She will be led away soon, veiled and silent, to the chamber prepared for her beneath the earth. Above her, Rome will carry on, markets bustling, soldiers drilling, children playing. But beneath the surface, another life will end in darkness, sealed by the words of men whose eyes never wavered. The togas of the judges gleam white in memory, their folds carefully arranged, their expressions unbroken. They are remembered not as men, but as instruments of order, as voices of the city itself. Their humanity, whatever doubts or fears they may have carried, is lost to us. What remains are the verdicts, the punishments, the rituals of condemnation. And in these, the Vestal's sacred duty, once celebrated, turns again and again into a crime judged by men who claim to speak for the gods. The marble still stands in Rome. The Forum lies quiet, its ruins scattered across the ground. Tourists walk where trials once determined life and death, where judges in togas once sat with eyes of stone. The voices are gone, but the silence remembers. And in that silence, the fate of the Vestals lingers, their trials echoing like whispers through the broken columns, a reminder of how fragile honour is when it is weighed in the eyes of power. When the judges had spoken, when the verdict had been carved into the air with words colder than iron, the city did not rush to execution. Rome moved with ritual, with precision, with a kind of cruelty so deliberate it resembled ceremony. For the Vestal condemned, death was not to arrive with the swiftness of a blade or the violence of fire. Hers was to be a quieter passage, staged as a sacred rite, a burial not of the dead, but of the living. The Romans called it mercy, that no blood would be spilled, that the sanctity of the priestess's body would remain untouched. Yet mercy, in this case, was only another word for slow annihilation. The preparations began with silence. No shouts, no jeering mobs. The people understood that what was to follow was not a spectacle of entertainment, but a sacred act. Even as curiosity stirred in their hearts, restraint was demanded. For the woman walking to her grave was still, in some way, holy. She had carried the goddess's fire, had spoken prayers that bound the city to the divine. To treat her with open contempt was to risk angering the gods further. And so the crowd lined the streets in muted awe, their whispers carried like wind through marble columns. The condemned Vestal was dressed in the same garments she had worn for years of service. The white veil, the ribbons, the carefully arranged folds of cloth that once proclaimed her purity. Now those garments had turned into her funeral shroud. Her face, hidden beneath the veil, revealed nothing to those who watched. Was she weeping? Was she defiant? The crowd could not know. She was no longer permitted to be seen as a woman with human emotions. She was a vessel, a symbol, moving slowly toward the earth that would consume her. The procession began in the Forum, the heart of the city. Soldiers walked at her side, but not to restrain her. No chains bound her wrists, for Rome would not dishonour her in such a way. She walked free, though every step was heavy with inevitability. Ahead of her lay the Campus Celeratus, the field of wickedness, just outside the city's walls. It was there that the chamber had been prepared, a tomb not for the dead, but for one who still breathed. The Romans, careful in their piety, would not stain the sacred boundaries of the city with her burial. To entomb her within the walls would be to bring impurity into Rome itself. And so they led her beyond the gates, as if casting corruption into the earth beyond their own threshold. The chamber itself was small, scarcely more than a hole in the ground, its entrance sealed by stone. Within, space had been carved out for the bare necessities of life: a couch, a lamp, a little food, some water, a small amount of oil. These provisions, meagre as they were, served a grim purpose. Rome could claim it had not killed her. Instead, it had provided her with the means to survive, if the gods so chose. If she perished, it was by fate, not by the city's hand. In this way, Rome preserved its sense of piety, even as it committed one of the most merciless punishments imaginable. As the procession neared the chamber, the silence deepened. Those who followed the priestess in her final steps did so with solemn faces, as though they were not condemning her, but offering her as sacrifice. The Pontifex Maximus himself often walked among them, his presence lending divine sanction to the act. He did not look at her as a man might look at a woman. He looked at her as one might regard an offering placed upon an altar. Her body, her life, her breath, all were part of a ritual designed to cleanse the city of guilt. At the entrance of the tomb, the condemned paused. Perhaps her breath caught. Perhaps her knees trembled. The crowd could not see her eyes beneath the veil, but they must have imagined what she felt. The weight of earth pressing in, the chill of stone waiting below, the knowledge that her life would end not with a final cry, but with silence, alone in darkness. A priest spoke prayers, words meant to carry her spirit to the gods. She was still sacred, even as she was condemned, and Rome took care to treat her as both victim and offering. Then came the descent. A ladder, narrow and steep, led downward into the earth. The Vestal, her garments brushing against the stone, stepped carefully into her living grave. She did not fight. To resist would have been useless. The ritual demanded composure, demanded that she pass from the world above with dignity. When she reached the bottom, the chamber closed around her. Those above withdrew the ladder, and with it, her last connection to the world of light. The entrance was sealed with heavy stones, each pushed into place with the groan of labourers straining against their weight. With every stone set, the sound of the outside world grew fainter. No shouts, no footsteps, no voices would reach her now. Only silence, broken by her own breath and the flicker of the oil lamp left at her side. Above, the crowd dispersed, their duty fulfilled. The Pontifex Maximus turned away, his task completed. Rome, in its eyes, had cleansed itself. The woman was left to time, to hunger, to the dark embrace of earth. What she felt in those final hours we cannot know. History preserves no record of her thoughts, no cries scratched into stone, no last word carried to us by witnesses. Did she pray to Vesta, begging forgiveness? Did she curse the city that had betrayed her? Did she sit in silence, her hands folded, waiting for the slow passage of breath into nothingness? All we can know is that the chamber became her world, its walls closing in as her body weakened, her lamp burned low, and the provisions mocked her with their promise of life drawn out into suffering. The cruelty of the ritual lies not only in its method, but in its intent. Rome convinced itself it was acting with piety, sparing sacred blood from being spilled. Yet what it truly did was prolong death, stretching punishment into ritual, turning cruelty into a performance of reverence. The Vestal was not executed swiftly, but entombed alive, as though the city wished to savour its own absolution. By burying her beneath the earth, Rome buried its guilt with her, sealing both away in silence. The field of wickedness, where these burials took place, carried the memory of these acts. Though the chambers themselves vanished with time, the ground held the weight of those who had gone beneath it. Passers-by may have avoided the place, whispering prayers as they hurried past. For it was cursed ground, touched by impurity, yet sanctified by ritual. It was a scar upon the city, both feared and revered. The Romans themselves knew this, and they named it accordingly, a place where the wicked were laid to rest, though the wickedness lay less in the women buried there than in the judgment that condemned them. To modernize, the ritual seems unthinkable. To bury alive a young woman whose only crime may have been rumour, or the shifting winds of politics, is a cruelty almost unimaginable. Yet to the Romans, it was not cruelty, but necessity. The city's safety, its relationship with the gods, demanded it. A single life, however sacred, was a small price to pay for the survival of all, and so generation after generation, Rome repeated the ritual, each burial reaffirming its devotion, even as it silenced its most sacred daughters. The irony is sharp. These women, chosen as children, sworn to guard the eternal flame, raised to embody purity and devotion, ended not as revered figures, but as sacrifices buried in darkness. Their deaths were not recorded in songs or honoured in temples. They vanished into the earth, forgotten except as cautionary tales, their names preserved not for their service, but for their supposed crimes. Rome celebrated their role in life, but erased their humanity in death. And yet the ritual itself lingers in memory. It is recalled not as a detail of Roman law, but as a haunting emblem of the city's contradictions. The Vestals were exalted and imprisoned, sacred and condemned, revered and betrayed. Their burial alive stands as the ultimate symbol of this paradox. Women entombed in silence so that Rome might speak of its purity. Lives extinguished in darkness so that the city might continue in light. The stones of the Forum are quiet now, the field of wickedness long absorbed into the sprawl of centuries. But beneath that silence, the ritual of living death echoes still. It reminds us of a city that demanded perfection from those least able to resist its judgment, of a people who masked cruelty with piety, and of women who descended into the earth carrying both the honour of Rome and the weight of its betrayal. The stones were pushed into place, each one sealing out the world of light, until the chamber no longer belonged to the living, but to silence. Above the earth, footsteps faded, voices scattered into the wind, and the city resumed its breath, as though nothing had occurred. But below, in that narrow hollow carved from soil and stone, a life still flickered. The condemned Vestal remained, not yet a ghost, not yet a memory, but a woman alone in the weight of her final night. The chamber was small, scarcely wider than her outstretched arms. The air hung heavy, cool with the damp of buried earth, carrying none of the scents of Rome above. No incense from the temples, no smoke from hearths, no rush of the Tiber. Here there was only the stale odour of stone dust and the faint burning of oil from the lamp left at her side. Its flame wavered, fragile and stubborn, much like her own breath. Each flicker casting long shadows against the uneven walls. The provisions were laid neatly: a loaf of bread, a few dates, a small jar of water, and oil for the lamp. The couch, rough but serviceable, had been prepared as though this were not a tomb but a dwelling. Rome liked to pretend this was not execution. They had not spilled her blood, had not raised a sword against her. They had merely given her a room beneath the earth, furnished with what she might need. If death came, it was fate's decision, not theirs. Yet no one believed this. The woman herself knew the lie for what it was. Every object in that chamber mocked her. The bread that would grow stale in her trembling hands, the water that would run out before her strength did, the lamp oil that would sputter into darkness long before she ceased to breathe. What must it have been to sit upon that couch, veiled still, garments heavy with the dust of the descent? To hear nothing but the pulse of her own blood in her ears, to feel the walls pressing closer with every hour? Perhaps her thoughts darted like frightened birds, striking the stone over and over, seeking an escape that did not exist. Perhaps she prayed in whispers, words tumbling from her lips into the airless void, hoping the goddess she had served would listen, hoping that Vesta's flame, far above, still burned for her, but prayers carried no warmth down into that hollow. The sacred fire continued in its hearth, tended by others, while she lay here in shadow. Rome went on. The city still bustled with voices, still bargained in the Forum, still marched soldiers through its gates. Life did not pause for the fading of one woman. Her role, so exalted once, had collapsed into absence. Above, the world glowed. Below, her chamber cooled into silence. The lamp's flame became her companion. It bent and trembled with every breath she took, as though the air itself sought to remind her of her mortality. The shadows stretched into monstrous shapes, arches, looming figures, the illusion of movement in a place where none existed. Alone, the mind creates companions. Perhaps she thought she saw the outlines of her sisters, the other Vestals who had once shared her laughter, her training, her solemn duties. Perhaps she thought she saw her family, faces remembered from the day she had been taken as a child, voices she had not heard in years. The chamber became a stage for memory, a cruel mirror reflecting everything she had lost. Time here was different. Without the rhythm of day and night, hours blurred together. She might have counted her breaths, or measured the length of a prayer, clinging to fragments of order, in a place that swallowed time whole. The loaf of bread grew smaller in her hands, the jar of water lighter each time she lifted it. Soon she must have realized that the lamp, her last tether to the world above, would not last. Its oil would drain away, and with it, the shadows would vanish, leaving only the suffocating dark. Darkness was the final cruelty. It was not enough that she would starve, not enough that her body would weaken. She would be robbed of sight, robbed of even the comfort of flame. Alone in the black, the chamber would become infinite, walls vanishing into emptiness, her own body disappearing from her. She would not see her hands, would not see the bread, would not see the couch beneath her. She would dissolve into nothing before her breath ceased. This was the ritual's true power. Death here was not sudden, but stretched, not violent, but patient. Her understood the terror of silence, of isolation, of darkness. It was not blood that frightened the condemned, but time, hours and hours to think, to remember, to despair. Each moment became a weight, pressing harder than the stones above. Perhaps she tried to pray still, though the words may have faltered as hunger grew. Or perhaps she raged in whispers, cursing the city, cursing the men in togas whose eyes had condemned her. No one would hear. Her voice could rise and fall until her throat burned, but the earth swallowed all sound. That was the genius of this burial. Rome allowed her to speak, to cry, to pray, but to no one who would ever answer. The couch became her bed, her altar, her grave. She might have lain upon it, eyes open, staring into the ceiling, tracing its cracks as though they were maps. She might have curled tightly, arms wrapped around herself, as if to ward off the cold. Her body, once a vessel of purity, became a prisoner of the earth. No one would touch her. No one would hold her. She belonged now to stone and shadow. Above her, the city slept, unaware or unwilling to care. Perhaps a few still thought of her, a child she once knew, a priestess who once walked the forum. Perhaps her family remembered her face in dreams. But memory fades quickly when the living demand bread, war, and politics. She had been given to the earth. She was no longer theirs. And so the lamp dimmed, the shadows shortened, the flames sputtered. When at last the oil was gone, the darkness swallowed all. If she still breathed, she did so in blindness, each breath thinner, each heartbeat slower, until one moment, whether after hours or days, the silence claimed her fully. The chamber above remained sealed, its stones heavy, unmoved. No one came to check, no one to retrieve her body. That was the final erasure. She was not meant to be remembered, not meant to return to light. She was to become part of the earth, indistinguishable from soil, her bones blending with the cursed ground of the field of wickedness. Rome had consigned her not just to death, but to obscurity. And yet, though the city buried her, though the stones held her in silence, her story did not vanish. The memory of such burials lingered in whispers, in the writings of historians, in the fearful hush of citizens who passed by the cursed ground. The chamber may have been silent, but silence itself speaks. It tells of a woman entombed not for crime, proven but for suspicion, for rumour, for the fragile balance of Rome's sacred fire. It tells of a ritual that cloaked cruelty and sanctity, that demanded human lives as offerings to keep the gods content. The silent chamber beneath the earth became not just a tomb, but a symbol. It stood for the contradiction at the heart of Rome. Its reverence for purity entwined with its ruthless hunger for order, its exaltation of priestesses entwined with its willingness to bury them alive. That silence, that darkness, spoke of both faith and fear, of a city that demanded sacrifice, not from its enemies but from its most sacred daughters. And so, beneath the earth, the chamber remains in memory, a room where shadows danced, where a lamp flickered and died, where breath slowed into silence. Above, Rome thrived. Below, she vanished. Yet her absence still echoes, telling us of the price of duty, the weight of ritual, and the quiet cruelty of a city that buried its sacred women alive. The chamber held stillness so complete that it seemed no world could exist beyond its stone walls. Breath lingered there as a fragile rhythm, shallow and uneven, the only sound in a place that had forgotten voices. A figure lay upon the couch, her body weakened, her hands pale in the dim, dying glow of the lamp. The flame, which had been her companion through endless hours, had thinned into a trembling thread of light, struggling as she did, unwilling to surrender, yet destined to fall. Her chest rose with difficulty, each inhalation a burden, each exhalation a surrender. The air was heavy now, thick with the absence of movement, clinging with the damp weight of soil. Hunger had gnawed at her strength, thirst had parched her lips, and time had erased the sharpness of thought until only fragments drifted like dust in her mind. She remembered fragments of a childhood long stolen, a face glimpsed once before being taken into the service of Vesta, the sound of laughter from companions who had shared her duties. They flickered across her memory as shadows flicker across stone, brief, uncertain, already fading. There was no measure of time here. Perhaps it was night above the earth, or perhaps the streets of Rome blazed with sunlight. It mattered little. Down here, in this hollow carved for her, the world was stripped of day and night, reduced only to the slow collapse of her body. Her hand reached weakly toward the loaf of bread that remained untouched beside her, but her strength faltered, fingers falling short. Hunger no longer mattered. The body had moved beyond it. The thirst was sharper, burning in her throat, yet even the jar of water could not be lifted now. The chamber had turned her from priestess to prisoner, from woman to shadow. The lamp quivered once more. Its oil had thinned to almost nothing, and the flames sputtered, stretching, bending, as though reluctant to leave her alone. She watched it dim, with eyes that fluttered open and closed, struggling to remain awake. The flame was the last light she would ever see, the last companion of her vigil. When it vanished, she would enter a darkness unbroken, and in that darkness she knew her breath would not last long. Her lips parted in a whisper, perhaps a prayer, though the words came ragged, scattered, unfinished. She spoke not to the stone, not to Rome, not to the men whose judgment had buried her, but to the goddess she had once served. Her words dissolved into the chamber, as soft and brief as the flame itself. And then it happened. The lamp faltered, stuttered, and collapsed into smoke. The chamber fell into blackness. The absence was immediate, suffocating. Her eyes searched for light that was not there, for shapes that no longer existed. She raised a hand before her face and saw nothing, felt nothing but the brush of air against her skin. In this blackness, she became part of the chamber, indistinguishable from its walls. The silence deepened with the dark. Breath sounded louder now, raw and heavy in her ears. Each inhalation tore at her chest. Each exhalation slipped into the void. The couch beneath her no longer felt like a bed, but like earth itself, cradling her in its cold indifference. Her heart strained, beating unevenly, each pulse slower than the last. It was then, in that darkness, that memory returned, not as fragments but as waves. Faces long buried in her mind swam back. Her mother's eyes, her father's hand upon her shoulder, the fleeting warmth of family stolen when she was chosen. She remembered her sisters in service, walking together in white veils, carrying water to the temple, tending the eternal fire. She remembered the hush of the atrium vestae, the crackle of sacred flame, the cool marble beneath her sandals. Each memory arrived not as pain, but as comfort, as though her mind sought to weave for her a final vision of the world she had once inhabited. Perhaps this was the mercy of the human heart, that even in the last, when the body failed, memory painted beauty upon the walls of darkness. Perhaps she did not see the stone chamber anymore, but fields, skies, the warmth of light upon her face. Perhaps she imagined the eternal flame itself burning steadily above her, untouched by her absence. Her breath slowed. She knew it. She felt it. The body announces its departure, not with suddenness, but with a long unravelling, each thread pulled quietly, patiently, until little remains. Her hands lay still now, folded across her chest. Her eyes closed, not out of weariness, but because the blackness outside them matched the blackness within. For a moment, it may have seemed as though she lingered between two worlds, not alive fully, not gone fully, hovering in a silence where memory and breath mingled. Her lips moved once more. A word, a plea, a name perhaps, though none would ever know. It dissolved into the airless chamber. Then the breath ended. It ended not with violence, not with drama, but with the quietest of departures. A final exhale softened into stillness. A last heartbeat faded into silence. The couch held her body, but she no longer felt it. The chamber embraced her wholly, its darkness complete, its silence unbroken. Above, Rome lived on. The forum bustled, voices rose, soldiers marched, merchants bartered. The sacred fire burned in Vesta's temple, tended by other hands. No one paused, no one marked the instant of her passing. To Rome, her end had already occurred the moment the chamber was sealed. This was merely the silence catching up with her. Yet in that stillness, a truth endured. The last breath of a Vestal was not only her own, it was the echo of Rome's cruelty disguised as piety, its hunger for control cloaked in ritual. The city claimed to protect itself by burying her, claimed to honour the gods by sealing her beneath the earth. But the soundless chamber testified to something else. That Rome could silence its daughters, but could not erase the memory of their final breaths. The earth would hold her now. No pyre would consume her body. No mourners would lay flowers. No tombstone would bear her name. She became part of the soil, unseen, unspoken, but not entirely forgotten. Whispers carried her story forward, whispers that told of the chamber, of the bread and water, of the lamp and its dying flame. Whispers of her last breath, soft yet enduring, carried through time like embers hidden in ash. It is those whispers we inherit. They reach us across centuries, telling not of grandeur or triumph, but of a life sealed beneath the city, of silence, of breath fading into nothing. They remind us that even in the greatest of empires, cruelty was wrapped in ritual, and innocence was buried beneath stone. The last breath of a Vestal was not lost. It became part of Rome's own breath, part of the uneasy air that the city itself drew as it built, conquered, and remembered. And in that sense, her silence still speaks. The earth had closed over her, sealing away the silence of her last breath. But silence never stays buried in a city like Rome. In the marble streets above, in the crowded markets, in the shaded courtyards where citizens gathered to whisper, her story began to surface again. Not as a proclamation, not as an official record, but as rumour. And in Rome, rumour was a power more enduring than law. A city so vast and restless could never truly hold its tongue. The cries of vendors at dawn, the clatter of hooves over stone, the chants of priests, the arguments of senators, all of these sounds wove into a fabric where even the faintest whisper could slip through. It was in these whispers that the tale of the buried Vestal found its life. They spread not in straight lines, but in circles, curling like smoke through taverns and markets, through the stalls of butchers and bakers, through the quiet gossip of matrons leaning from balconies. Few had seen the procession that led her to the earth, for such things were done in secrecy. Yet secrecy itself feeds the imagination. One claimed he had heard the scraping of stone as the chamber was sealed. Another swore he had glimpsed the priestess's veil fluttering in the wind before she vanished below. None could prove their words, and none truly needed to. In Rome, it was the suggestion of truth, not its certainty, that gave rumour its strength. Mothers told their daughters to avert their eyes from the temple of Vesta, lest they fall under its dangerous shadow. Old men muttered that the gods grew restless when their handmaidens were condemned. Street children wove stories that the buried Vestal's spirit roamed at night, wandering the alleys unseen, her steps muffled like the silence of her chamber. They said she brought cold air with her, a breath that extinguished lamps and left hearths shivering. The senators scoffed in public, of course, but even among them the story lingered. Behind marble walls and polished rhetoric, unease stirred. If the sacred fire burned weaker one evening, or if its flames sputtered too much in the wind, there were murmurs. Was it a sign? Had the gods noticed what had been done? The very men who condemned her began to glance nervously at the altar flame, as though fearing it might betray their judgment. It was not only fear of the divine that troubled the city, it was the shame of humanity. For all the grandeur of their rituals, Romans knew, deep down, what had been done. To bury alive a daughter of Vesta was no ordinary act. It was a crime wrapped in ceremony, cruelty wrapped in piety. The city's citizens knew, even if they did not speak it loudly, that innocence could be silenced under the weight of tradition. And so the rumours took on different shapes depending on who spoke them. To some, she was guilty beyond doubt, a traitor to her vows who deserved no pity. To others, she was a victim of politics, condemned not for her own actions, but for the needs of men who wielded religion as a weapon. To the poor, she became a ghostly reminder that even the most sacred could be crushed by the city's hunger for order. To the wealthy, she was a shadow that haunted their banquets, her absence pressing upon their luxury like a silent accusation. Rumour grew in Rome the way ivy grows over stone, slow yet unstoppable, covering every surface until the original shape beneath was hidden. What truly happened in the chamber mattered less than what was imagined. Some whispered she had cursed her judges as the stones closed, calling down misfortune upon their families. Others claimed she had died in serenity, her spirit rising with dignity to the goddess she had served. And still others told that her final breath had carried a sound, a sigh that shook the earth itself, faint but felt in the stillness of the night. Rome was a city that lived on spectacle, yet this was a spectacle hidden from sight. That only made it more potent. Gladiators fought in the Colosseum before tens of thousands, but their deaths did not echo in the same way as the silent burial of a single Vestal. The city could not stop speaking of what it was forbidden to see. In taverns, men leaned close over wine cups, lowering their voices to repeat the story. In marketplaces, sellers slipped the tale between sales of figs and grain. Even children carried it in their games, pretending to seal one another beneath imaginary stones, laughing nervously at the thought of the darkness below. The power of rumour was that it left room for the imagination. No one could describe exactly how the chamber looked once closed, or how long breath lasted in its shadows. And so each mind filled the gap. Some pictured her struggling against the stone, clawing at the walls in desperation. Others imagined her lying serene, her face calm, as though she had accepted her fate. Still others whispered of her spirit escaping, wandering the city streets, brushing past the very ears that spoke her name. These whispers did more than entertain, they unsettled. For if such a fate could befall the most sacred women in Rome, then what protection had anyone else? If purity itself could be condemned, then who was safe from judgment? A butcher who cheated his scales, a soldier who deserted, a senator who lied. Were these lesser crimes than a Vestal's rumoured betrayal? And yet none of them would face the chamber beneath the earth. That realisation gnawed quietly at the city's conscience, even if few dared admit it. There were nights when the rumours grew sharper, darker. On evenings when thunder rolled across the hills, or when the Tiber swelled with restless waters, some claimed it was her vengeance. They said her last breath had unsettled the gods, that Rome itself would be punished for its cruelty. Farmers in the countryside whispered of poor harvests, linking them to her burial. Mothers clutched their children closer when strange winds rattled the shutters. The city lived on omens, and the buried Vestal became one more shadow in its endless gallery of fears. Yet rumour is not only fear, it is fascination. The forbidden draws the curious. There were those who lingered near the field of wickedness, staring at the ground where she lay. They did not speak, did not place offerings, but their eyes searched the soil, as though it might reveal something. A tremor of unease kept them from stepping closer, yet still they returned, drawn by the mystery of a life taken not by sword but by silence. Time passed, yet the whispers did not die. They became part of the city's breath, carried in its markets, murmured in its forums, embroidered into its tales. The burial of a Vestal was not an event Rome could ever cleanse from itself. It lingered as a stain, a quiet reminder that beneath the marble, beneath the fire and pageantry, there was cruelty hidden in ritual. And so Rome's streets continued to echo, not with cries of rebellion, not with open accusation, but with the subtler sound of rumour. It was the sound of unease, of a city haunted by its own deeds, of citizens who spoke carefully, as though fearing that even their whispers might summon the shadow of the woman they had buried. The empire thrived above ground, but beneath its grandeur lay a silence that no rumour could fully bury. It was the silence of her last breath, carried upward through the stones, transformed into whispers that wound their way through every street. Rome spoke of her not to remember, and yet by speaking they remembered, and so the city became both her tomb and her echo, holding within it the ghost of a story too powerful to remain sealed. The murmur of the city never ended. From the echo of sandals striking marble steps to the cries of traders lifting their wares at dawn, Rome was a city alive with unbroken sound. Yet beneath the bustle, beneath the grandeur of arches and the rhythm of soldiers on parade, another hum lingered, softer but more enduring, the quiet memory of what had been done to its sacred daughters. It was not written in stone, not etched in law, but carried in whispers, in glances, in the uneasy silence that fell whenever the subject of the Vestals arose. Time for Rome was supposed to wash away everything. Empires stretched, wars were fought, new generations rose, and the city's appetite for spectacle and conquest devoured yesterday's sorrows. But some things never fully dissolved. The burial of a Vestal, though hidden from public eyes, was not forgotten. It clung to the fabric of the city like ash, fine, light, easily scattered by the wind, yet impossible to erase completely. Ash was, after all, a word the Romans knew well. They saw it in their hearths each morning, the residue of yesterday's flames. They saw it after the great pyres, where warriors were consumed, their bodies surrendered to the gods. They knew ash as the remnant of fire, and fire was the very essence of Vesta. And so, as stories spread of the priestess buried alive, the image of ash lingered in the collective imagination. Her innocence, once as radiant as the flame she guarded, was thought of as reduced to shadowy remains, scattered invisibly through the city, carried with the breath of rumour. It was said that after her burial, the sacred fire in the temple flickered more often than before. Some called it coincidence, some blamed neglect, but others insisted it was the shadow of her loss. A flame that had been tended by countless priestesses over generations seemed restless, trembling as though caught in some unseen current. Each time it wavered, eyes turned toward the temple, waiting for disaster, for the gods' judgment. Even the priests, cloaked in certainty during the daylight, felt the weight of unease when the flame shivered in the night air. Rome, however, could not halt its march for unease. The empire thrived, its armies stretched farther, its rulers draped themselves in triumph. Yet in quiet corners, the story of the Vestals became a mirror. Citizens who repeated the tale at their hearths began to see their own empire differently. If even the purest could be entombed alive beneath ritual, what justice truly governed Rome? If innocence could be reduced to silence by decree, what shadows lay beneath the marble pride of the city? It was not rebellion that stirred in these thoughts. Rome was far too heavy, too immovable, for whispers to unseat it. Instead, it was a quiet melancholy, a recognition that empire itself was built not only on victories and temples, but on sacrifices hidden from sunlight. The Vestal's burial became one such sacrifice, folded into the city's memory, not as an open wound, but as a bruise, a darkened mark that pulsed beneath the skin of Roman pride. Children, who never saw the ritual with their own eyes, grew up hearing fragments of it woven into the stories of their elders. For them, the buried priestess became less a real figure and more a ghostly presence, an emblem of the cost of Rome's greatness. They whispered that her soul had not vanished, but had fused with the city itself, a silent watcher in its streets. Some claimed to hear her in the faint crackle of the sacred flame, as though each spark carried a voice too small to understand but too present to deny. Others began to reinterpret the ritual not as a punishment, but as a transformation. To them, she had become part of the soil of Rome, the hidden foundation upon which the empire walked. Her chamber beneath the earth was not just a tomb, but a womb of silence, giving birth to an eternal reminder that purity, once corrupted, did not vanish, it endured as shadow. Rome, so full of monuments, unknowingly carried her as its most secret monument, a structure without marble, a shrine without offerings, existing only in memory and rumour. As the years passed, the tale shifted with the tellers. In some versions, she was guilty, her burial a necessary severing to preserve Rome's favour with the gods. In others, she was blameless, crushed by the ambitions of men who feared what they could not control. And in still others, she was something more myth than woman, an eternal guardian whose last breath seeped into the empire itself, never leaving, never forgiving. The truth was less important than the resonance. Each telling reshaped her into what Rome needed her to be: a scapegoat, a warning, a ghost. The senators who had condemned her long since turned to dust themselves, but their decision lingered. Every trial that followed, every accusation of a Vestal, carried the echo of that burial. Citizens remembered how easily innocence could be transformed into crime when draped in the toga of authority. Even those who believed firmly in Rome's justice could not entirely silence the doubt planted by her story. It was a doubt that grew quietly, hidden in the empire's heart, like a shadow behind the brilliance of its victories. The paradox of Rome was that it demanded both purity and sacrifice, yet purity itself often became the sacrifice. The Vestals embodied this contradiction more than anyone else. Their duty was to maintain the flame, to preserve the innocence of Rome's spiritual core. But when one faltered, or when suspicion painted her as faltering, she was consumed not by fire, but by earth. Ashes of innocence, shadows of empire. The cycle repeated itself, a reminder that Rome's grandeur was never without its buried secrets. And still the city thrived. Crowds cheered in amphitheatres, generals returned in triumph, emperors built new monuments to their names. Rome stood as eternal, the mistress of the known world. But in the quiet hours, when the streets emptied and the last torches burned low, some swore they could feel the weight of the buried. They said the ground itself seemed heavier beneath the temples, as though the city carried more than just stone. It carried silence, the silence of those sacrificed to preserve the illusion of order. There was a haunting symmetry in the way Rome lived with its shadows. For every column that rose into the sky, there was a story buried beneath it. For every triumphal arch, a name forgotten, a life silenced. The Vestal, sealed beneath earth, became not an exception, but a symbol of this balance. Her absence was her presence, her silence her voice. As generations passed, Rome changed. Republic yielded to empire, emperors rose and fell, gods were replaced or reimagined. But her story endured, not in the annals of official history, not carved into monuments, but in the murmur of voices that refused to forget. For in forgetting her, Rome would have to forget a part of itself, the part that revealed its fragility, its cruelty, its dependence on shadows to sustain its light. The city remained a paradox until its end, eternal in stone, yet haunted in memory. And so the buried Vestal lived on, not as flesh, not as ash, but as whisper. A whisper of innocence extinguished, a whisper of empire revealed in its harshest truth. Rome's streets carried her in every echo, her silence woven into the noise, her shadow stretching across centuries. In the end, what Rome built was vast, magnificent, world-shaping. But beneath the arches and domes, beneath the Senate and the sacred fire, there lingered the faint outline of a chamber where innocence had been sealed away. The empire stood in sunlight, yet its roots were tangled in shadow. And in those shadows lay the ashes of the Vestal, scattered through time, inseparable from Rome itself. Rome. And so as the last echoes fade, we find ourselves stepping back from the marble corridors and the silent chambers of ancient Rome. Tonight, we walked through a story that was not painted in triumphal arches or sung in the hymns of victory, but whispered in the shadows, the fate of Rome's Vestal Virgins. We saw how young daughters were taken from their homes, veiled in white, and placed before a fire that demanded perfection. We followed their lives behind marble walls, where duty weighed heavier than freedom, where every breath was measured against the will of the gods and the eyes of the state. And in those rare, terrible moments when vows were said to be broken, we descended with them into the earth itself, into chambers where silence was their final companion. The story of the Vestals reminds us of Rome's contradictions, how a city that lit the world with roads, laws, and monuments could also bury its own daughters alive in the name of order. It forces us to ask, what is the price of purity, of duty, of survival, when innocence itself is turned into sacrifice? As the centuries passed, Rome continued to rise, to conquer, to declare itself eternal. Yet beneath its stones, the whispers endured. They linger still, like faint breaths in the ruins, like shadows stretching across time, asking us to remember what power often tries to hide. If you've made it here to the end of tonight's journey, thank you for sharing these quiet hours with me. Before you go, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, so these forgotten histories can keep reaching you wherever you are. And in the comments, tell me, what did you feel as you listened to the story of the Vestals? Did you sense the weight of their silence, the chill of their fate? I'd love to hear your reflections. Until next time, may the night be calm, and may history's whispers guide you gently to rest.